Hello, I'm Kris Osborn. Welcome. Glad you're here. Key question today for many of our viewers. Many of them are expert and have heard this 100 times. Are aircraft carriers obsolete? Have Chinese anti-ship missiles like the DF-26, which can reportedly fire 2,000 miles, made it such that aircraft carriers can no longer project power? Well, it's a debate, and there have been lots of analyses and lots of opinions. But what does the Navy say? The Navy's always been pretty confident that their carriers can operate anywhere they need to. Why is that?
I will tell you, Ford has earned her combat systems qualification. She's earned every certification she needs to deploy, and I fully believe that the aircraft carrier, her air wing, and her battle group are capable of defending themselves.
You probably heard a couple of key terms there used by Captain Metcalf: carrier air wing and carrier strike group. That was probably by design, because carrier survivability is massively increasing, not just for the carrier as its own platform, which is increasingly ruggedized for combat, but as mentioned, the carrier air wing. There are platforms like the MQ-25 Stingray. Now that's a drone, the first of its kind carrier launch refueler drone. So instead of having to place people at risk with a manned large tanker that's vulnerable to enemy fire, a drone can refuel combat aircraft in flight and essentially double the combat radius of something like an F-35C. That's extremely significant if a carrier needs to stay slightly further offshore to stay out of harm's way when it comes to anti-ship missiles. They still, with something like this refueler, have the ability to project power. The other thing that often gets lost in some of this discussion is the broader context. Now, of course, the Navy doesn't talk specifically or at great length about technical detail with ship survivability, but there are a number of things that are discussed quite openly and quite regularly. One of them, the electromagnetic spectrum. I remember Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Greener said, "Whoever controls the electromagnetic spectrum will prevail in war." Well, sure enough, EW, technologies like CWIP, are incredibly significant because they can find what's called a line of bearing and essentially identify and jam the guidance signal of an incoming anti-ship missile, essentially throw it off course. So that pertains to the other thing Captain Metcalf mentioned, which was the carrier strike group. Carriers are often defended by ships surrounding them, cruisers and destroyers, and the Navy is already arming destroyers with laser weapons. They have an optical function, but they can also incinerate the enemy drones or incoming anti-ship missiles. You also have layered defenses, which are increasingly getting larger, more precise, and better networked. For example, the SM-32A is a larger, more precise interceptor fired from vertical launch systems. That actually is tested successfully against potential ICBM targets. It's ballistic missile defense. For closer in, you have the SM-6 and then the SM-2. The SM-6 with a dual mode seeker has potential offensive uses as well. And there's networking with programs like NIFCA, or Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air. Something like an aerial gateway, a Hawkeye, or even an F-35 can use sensors to look beyond the horizon to warn ships of incoming anti-ship missiles from further standoff distances, shortening that window and giving commanders an opportunity to make the right countermeasure or the right defensive decision. You also have closer in defenses, things like the evolved Sea Sparrow Missile Block 2. Now that has sea skimming mode, so it fires off the deck of a destroyer or a cruiser and then can take out an anti-ship missile flying lower beneath the radar aperture parallel to the ocean. Other things like CRAM or rolling airframe missile, and for the closest in threats, there's something called CWIS, Close-In Weapon Systems. It's a phalanx gun, which the Army uses it for base protection. It fires hundreds of projectiles in a matter of seconds to take out enemy incoming air threats, perhaps projectiles, drones, or even small boats. More recently, the Navy has upgraded it to a 1B variant, wherein it can hit surface threats as well, small boats and things along those lines. So with all of this context, it might explain part of why, without adding a whole lot of detail, the Navy's pretty confident about the value added of the carrier platform, which is one reason why the USS Ford, it's operational now.
So let's talk for a minute about Gerald R. Ford. She's fully transitioned to an in-service ship. She now is finished her early deployment last fall, had a very successful deployment with several NATO allies, and as of this weekend, returned home from her Comp 2X, her final graduation exercise to deploy. That Comp 2X is several weeks of working with the Air Wing and the battle group ships that she will go on deployment with. She earned all of her certifications and met all the requirements to deploy.
Added to this equation, there are tactical adjustments that the Navy often discusses when it comes to survivability at sea. The Navy's much discussed distributed maritime operations looks at more disaggregated formations and the use of manned-unmanned teaming, even large platforms potentially being motherships controlling fleets of unmanned systems. So there's an increased possibility for surface ships to be in a more disaggregated or distributed manner due to long-range sensors, multi-domain networking, and the use of unmanned systems. Forward operating aerial or surface drones could check an enemy perimeter for weak areas, could conduct forward surveillance or even attacks in certain cases. Amphibious attacks can be launched from further standoff distances as well, in part due to the advent of unmanned systems. So it aligns conceptually with a lot of how the Navy's thinking in terms of a tactical approach in a new threat environment. What this, in conjunction with all the technological innovations, mean, well, it might help explain why the Navy's very confident carriers aren't going anywhere. Glad you're here. Kris Osborn, Warrior Maven.